Morning, friends. Good to be with you today, whether you're here in the room, joining us online. If you are a guest with us today, maybe this is your first time, I want to offer you a special welcome. So glad you've chosen to spend your morning with us here today. We are a church with a mission. We want to bring healing, connection, and purpose to people all around Lake Norman, and in some cases, all around the world, like with Operation Christmas Child, through the love of Jesus. So thank you, Alex, for being with us. Thank you, team, for being with us and having the opportunity to partner with Operation Christmas Child. As you can see, we're now in full swing in our new ministry year. The school season is all the way fully underway. Our ministry year is underway, and we're looking ahead toward the holiday season, Operation Christmas Child, and so many opportunities to love and serve people through it. So excited about all that is coming, and excited about a number of things that are ramping up as we get fully into our new ministry year. First, I want to thank many of you who expressed appreciation and gratitude to our leadership team. This past week, a bunch of the ladies from our Tuesday morning Bible study put together a great lunch for our staff team. We got notes of encouragement for all our different staff members. If you were a part of that, just want to thank you on behalf of our team. That was so kind, so encouraging. It's such a privilege to serve you and to be part of a family that loves and cares for one another. So thank you so much for your expressions of gratitude and appreciation, and just know that we appreciate you. It is a privilege to serve God's kingdom together. A couple other things coming up in the month of November, along with our opportunity to partner with Operation Christmas Child. We have two new elders to actually put forward as our leadership team. Our oversight team here at the church, Ron Hoppy and Eddie Rowland, have been nominated by you, vetted by the elders, and are being presented to the membership of Lake Norman Baptist to be approved to serve a 3-year term on our elder council. You'll hear more about Eddie and Ron over these next few weeks, and then the vote will be the weekend before Thanksgiving. This is kind of how it works in our church. We have a 30-day vetting period for our elders, who are our overseeing council for all that we do here as a church. So it's an important role of membership. If you don't know one of these men, Ron or Eddie, and you are a member, there's an opportunity over these next 30 days to seek them out, ask them any questions, to vet them, and we'll share more information about them and their stories as well. Also, the first Wednesday in November, we're going to have a town hall meeting to discuss some of the developments that have come along in our For Lake Norman project. If you've been around for the last couple of years, you know we've been in this season of making some new investments in our ministries and in our campus to support the mission and vision that God has given us. And so some important new things have happened that we want to share with you related to these campus investments in particular, and also with the Department of Transportation road plans. So if you've been around Lake Norman, you know they're expanding Samford, they're expanding Catawba, and how that impacts our plans. There's actually some exciting information we want to share with you, and there's some detail to talk through. So if you're a member, would love for you to come out that Wednesday night, November 5th. But you don't have to be a member. If you're around and you're engaged and interested in what's happening in the life of the church, would encourage you. We're going to be right in here, 6:30 on Wednesday for a For Lake Norman town hall update. You don't want to miss it. It's going to be a cool time together about what God is doing to support the mission and vision that he has called us to and what we can be a part of together. So today we are coming toward the end. It's always surprising to me how quickly these series go by. But we have 2 weeks left, today and next week, in our study of Job. And we're thinking about what God is doing in our lives. We're excited about what God is doing in the life of our church and in our community. But we also recognize that we all go through seasons of life that aren't the winning seasons. And how we play the game of life, how we relate to God, how we trust God and live in those seasons is of utmost importance for us. We need to learn how to trust God and how to live well, not just in the winning seasons of life, but in the losing seasons as well. And we've based this on 4 things that are true. We all go through losing seasons, and those losses can derail us from trusting God and living well. But winning traditions can come through losing seasons, and most importantly, we've been seeing how God builds winning traditions even through the losing seasons of our lives. And we've been learning the lessons through the story of Job. We've been walking through this story of this Old Testament character named Job, who was known as the greatest man in the East, the greatest man in the land at the time and in the place where he lived, but he literally lost everything, all his possessions, his family, his health. And throughout this long book, we see him processing that. We've seen how he wrestled with God, how he cried out to God over this. We've seen how his friends came and gave him a mix of comfort, but also accusation as they tried to help him understand why all of this might have been happening. And it's a long book. It's a heavy book. It's a hard book in many ways. We've seen the importance of pausing for wisdom as we go through these challenging seasons in life. And as we get close to the end of the story, we're actually introduced to a new character. And this new character is maybe the most mysterious character in the story. In fact, in the history of biblical interpretation, people have debated about how we should understand this character. And his name is Elihu. And I Googled a picture to kind of help us wrap our minds around what this scene might have looked like. So here's this picture of a young man. He's kind of raising his hand because he's got some things to say to Job, who is kind of in the shadows of this tent here. His three friends who are sitting, having this ongoing dialogue with Job. And then there's some people in the background looking in on this conversation. And this actually represents how we believe this whole story of Job took place. Job was a public figure. Everybody knew who Job was. And so it became well known the losses that he experienced. And we believe, because of the way the dialogue pans out, that a lot of the statements that are made throughout this story are made not just to one another, as Job dialogues with his friends, but to an onlooking group of people who would have gathered to see, what's Job going to say? What are his friends going to say? And there's this young man named Elihu who has sat and listened to the three friends and Job sort of talk about why has all of this been happening. And of course, we saw this a few weeks ago. Job's friends were convinced that Job had some grievous sin that nobody knew about. Like, you had us fooled, Job. We all thought you were a good guy, but clearly you are a gross, heinous sinner because of all this suffering that God has brought your way. That's what they thought. They were wrong about that, but that was what they were trying to convince Job of. And here this young man's been listening to all of this. And he's now got something to say. And I want to share just some of the things that Elihu says and the way that he says it, because what Elihu represents in this story, whoever he was and however we understand him, he represents the importance of not only what is said, but how it's said and when it's said. And how we receive some of the things in our lives, especially in the losing seasons, that might be the very thing we need to hear most, but it might be the hardest thing for us to hear. And sometimes we get messages coming our way, and they're coming from someone that not only is it a message we may not want to hear, but we're really not going to hear it from that person, right? You can think about somebody in your life that they're trying to get you to understand something, and you're like, yeah, you might be right about that, but not coming from you. And so Elihu comes and he starts to say some things, and I want you to kind of be the judge of it yourself. We're going to hear how Elihu presents his case, and then we're going to hear some of the things that Elihu says. But first, how he goes about it. Here's his approach to Job and his friends, and we're going to pick it up in Job chapter 32. 42 chapters in Job, so we're getting toward the end, and here this new character emerges. And the first thing that he has to say is, hey, I'm young, so I waited around, but now you made me mad, and I've got some things to say. Job 32, beginning in verse 1. Said, so these three men stopped answering Job. Those were the friends. Because he was righteous in his own eyes. But Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite of the family of Ram, became very angry with Job for justifying himself rather than God. He was also angry with the three friends because they had found no way to refute Job and yet had condemned him. So they couldn't prove Job wrong, but they kept on piling on their accusations anyway. Now Elihu had waited before speaking to Job because they were older than he. But when he saw that the three men had nothing more to say, his anger was aroused. So Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, said, I am young in years and you are old. That is why I was fearful, not daring to tell you what I know. I thought, age should speak. Advanced years should teach wisdom. So here's Elihu. He speaks up and he acknowledges, hey, I'm a lot younger than you guys. And just for context, our best understanding of Job's age is that he was probably in his mid-50s, maybe pushing 60. We think so because of the story of his children. The story opened with Job's kids who were grown, sort of emerging adults, and they were probably in their 20s or so. So if Job's 10 children were in their 20s, Job was probably in his 50s or so. So this is kind of Job, and what we have here is Job dialoguing with some of his contemporaries, and then somebody probably about the age of his kids shows up. And so imagine if that's you, if you're a parent and you've got kids, and one of your kids' friends comes up and is like, hey, I know you're older than I am and you've lived a lot more life than I have, but I got some things to tell you. I mean, and you don't have to be a parent to understand that, right? I mean, if you're in high school and a middle schooler comes up to you and is like, hey, I know you're older and all that and you're driving now, but, I'm going to tell you what life is all about, right? Like, this is kind of the dynamic. Here's Elihu, and he's coming up and he's lecturing these guys who have lived a lot more life than he has, and this is his approach. It's like he gets it, but I'm going to say it anyway. And so here's Elihu as he continues. A little bit further down, he says this, I waited while you spoke. I listened to your reasoning while you were searching for words. I gave you my full attention, but not one of you has proved Job wrong. None of you has answered his arguments. A little bit later on, we hear him addressing this onlooking crowd. And he says, they are dismayed, these friends of Job's, and have nothing more to say. Words have failed them. Must I wait now that they are silent? Now that they stand there with no reply? I too will have my say. I too will tell what I know. For I am full of words, and the spirit within me compels me. Inside I'm like bottled up wine, like new wineskins, ready to burst. I must speak and find relief. I must open my lips and reply. Elihu had a message, and man, he couldn't hold it in any longer. You know what that's like sometimes, right? Like you're watching things happen, and you're like, I just got to say it, right? This is Elihu, and he's coming out, and he's saying it. So what did he say? He said a lot of things. We don't have time to see all of them, but here's where he started. In the next chapter, it opens up this way in Job 33:1. He says, but now Job, listen to my words. Pay attention to everything I say. I'm about to open my mouth. My words are on the tip of my tongue. My words come from an upright heart. My lips sincerely speak what I know. The Spirit of God has made me. The breath of the Almighty gives me life. Answer me then if you can. Stand up and argue your case before me. I'm the same as you in God's sight. I too am a piece of clay. No fear of me should alarm you, nor should my hand be heavy on you. Later on, he closes out this chapter. He says this, pay attention, Job, and listen to me. Be silent, and I will speak. If you have anything to say, answer me. Speak up, for I want to vindicate you. But if not, then listen to me. Be silent, and I will teach you wisdom. Really? So Elihu comes, and you get why, like, okay, when people are reading Elihu, you're like, okay, how are we supposed to understand this guy? There's some statements that sound really pretentious, don't they? Like he comes out and he's like, hey, pay attention to everything I say. I know I'm about the age of your kids and all, and you've lived a lot of life, and yeah, you're supposed to be the greatest man around, but you need to pay attention to me and what I say. And he goes so far as to say, be silent, Job, and I will teach you wisdom. And I got to confess, I kind of take issue with that a little bit. If you get my Friday email, you heard me confess that as a parent, I got 5 kids, 3 of them are adults now. I'm not looking for parenting advice from books from parents who have like 2 toddlers. And I know some of you have 2 toddlers, and I know you're doing great, but don't come telling me how to raise teenagers. You know what I mean? Like, you may have something to say. In fact, you may have the best wisdom around, but my pride's not going to let me listen to you. Right? We get that, right? It's just kind of how our pride works inside of us. And he's making some statements that sound like maybe he's trying to write the book that he shouldn't be writing. But also mixed in with that, there's some sincere statements that kind of sneak their way in. And he says, my words come from an upright heart. Like he's younger, but he's kind of trying to check himself as best he can. He's eager, but he's also trying to recognize, right, his place. He says, you don't have to fear me like you do God, which is interesting. It's like Elihu knows that if God has to come himself, It's going to hurt a lot more, Job. And you know what? He's right. We actually saw a few weeks ago, remember, at the very end of the book, God speaks to Job in the storm, and he brings it. So it's like, here's Elihu, and he's like, hey, better to hear it from me, even though I'm younger than you, than to hear it from God himself. So there's some concern for Job, and he says, I want to vindicate you. Like, I want to help you, Job. So there's some sincerity there. And then he goes on and he says a lot of other statements that are sort of prophetic, like the words that might be from a prophet, but also they kind of sound presumptuous as well. Things like, let us learn together, Job, what is good. He speaks to the onlooking crowd and he says, hey, Job here, he speaks without knowledge and he speaks without insight. Can you say that, Elihu? At one point he even says, I speak for God. And at the very end, he says, watch out, Job, because God's coming, and he's going to speak to you, and you better be careful. So who is Elihu? Like, that's been a question throughout the history of Job, and I'm curious how you hear these descriptions of Elihu, and you can read it for yourself from chapters 32 to 37 and make your own case. So who is Elihu? Is he a courageous prophet, or is he just a young punk? Like, who is this guy speaking to Job and his friends and anybody who would listen? Well, Bible scholars are divided on this. Many scholars, actually the more classic scholars like John Calvin writing in the 16th century, they see Job as a prophet. And they're like, no, he's actually speaking the word of the Lord. Other scholars read him and they can poke some holes in his argument and go, no, I don't think he was a prophet. He doesn't say he's a prophet. There's no indication of thus says the Lord like other prophets in the Bible. And also look at the way he speaks to Job. And so there's debate to this day. And in fact, I've read several sources just in studying for this series, but the two that I've leaned the most on that generally will agree and that are complementary on most things in Job are divided on this one. One says Elihu's a prophet, and that's where his authority comes from. And you better listen to everything he says. The other says, he's more of a young punk. Like, there's truth in what he says, but there's also some fault to be found in him. And the challenge here is no matter whether he's a prophet or a punk, what everybody agrees on is that at least most of what he says is right. So it's not what he says that's so much a problem as it is how he says it and when he says it to a broken man who is suffering the worst losses that are imaginable in life. And so however you read Elihu, he does sound a little overzealous, maybe a little bit presumptuous. And you can possibly find some overstatements and things in his argument depending on how you read him, and there's cases to be made either way. My take is that, yeah, he might be a little overeager, a little overzealous. He's a young man speaking authentically as a young man. And that it could not have been easy for Job to hear what Elihu had to say. Right? That's my take. Like, whoever Elihu was, look at what Job was called to hear. Job had to have incredible humility to listen to what Elihu had to say. Amazing restraint. We don't have any indication that Job argued with Elihu in the way that he did with his friends. And then when God comes along, he actually reinforces the core of what Elihu has been arguing. Also, a lot of what Elihu says you can find in other parts of the Bible that would say, yeah, I mean, that's actually true. So whether he's a prophet or a punk, he actually makes a positive contribution. But I don't think the lesson for us is necessarily from Elihu. Like, even when you may be right, don't go be an Elihu for the people around you. Just because you're right, or you believe at the core you're right, doesn't mean you should say everything you think right now, or in this way. So we're not looking to be justified to go, yep, I'm going to be an Elihu in your life. Don't be that guy. I believe the lesson for us is in Job. Because whoever Elihu was, Job heard it. And we know from the end of the story, the things that Elihu said were actually the things that Job ultimately heard and responded to. Like what Job heard, even through this messenger of Elihu, is that God sometimes tells us things we don't want to hear in ways we don't want to hear them. I think that's one of the core truths we get from this dialogue between Elihu and Job and his friends. Because a lot of truth came in what Elihu said, and sometimes God does tell us things we don't want to hear in ways we don't want to hear them. Is that true? Well, it happens throughout the Bible. There's a really funny story in Numbers chapter 22 where God spoke to one of his prophets named Balaam through a donkey. So Balaam's riding along and his donkey starts trying to go all over the place. He's not following his instructions. Balaam starts beating on his donkey, and after a little while, God opens the mouth of the donkey, and he turns around and he speaks to Balaam, and he's like, hey, what are you beating me for? The funnier thing is that Balaam talks back to the donkey. Then there's this conversation they have. But God spoke to Balaam in a way that he didn't want to hear it, and from a messenger that he didn't want to hear from. Think about Joseph, the 11th of 12 brothers. And God was going to do some great things through Joseph, but he said some things that his older brothers did not want to hear from little brother. David, the greatest king that Israel ever knew. Maybe the greatest king the world has ever known. He was the 7th of his brothers. Nobody even thought he'd be a candidate to be king. He had something from the Lord, a calling from the Lord, but his older brothers, his dad, they didn't want to hear it. Not from David. Even Jesus. When Jesus, the eternal Son of God, began his public ministry of teaching, people didn't want to hear it. And you know who didn't want to hear it the most? The religious people. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the leaders of the temple, the religious system of Israel at the time, they killed Jesus because God was trying to say something that they didn't want to hear through a messenger that they did not want to hear from. So God does sometimes tell us things that we don't want to hear in ways that we don't want to hear it. And I think that's also the objection of a lot of people to Christianity. Like, you may be somebody, you know, you've been successful, you've got a lot. You know, what do these Christians have to say to you? Why do you need Jesus? Why do you need this message of forgiveness and sacrifice and serving others? That's a message that many people in our world are just too proud to hear. So it's true in our day with Christianity in general. It's true for the church. For some of you, it may be true of me. You're like, who are you? You're half my age, young punk, talking to me about Job and the Bible. Why am I listening to you? God sometimes has things to tell us that we don't want to hear in ways that we don't want to hear it. That's why I don't want to hear from the young parents about parenting. You know, if I'm honest, a little proud there. Little pride barrier. But it leads us to this other truth that comes through this relationship with Elihu and Job and his friends, and that's this. For our ultimate good, we need the wisdom and humility to receive hard things from God. We need it. Even if they come from places that we don't want to hear them. And this is what Job had. Job had the wisdom and the humility to receive, ultimately, Elihu's rebuke. He didn't argue back, and ultimately he did change his tune in exactly the kinds of ways that Elihu was saying. And so that's how Elihu approached Job and his friends. And I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so taking a look at what it is that Elihu said. Like, all right, what did he say then? What was so hard to hear that God wanted to say through Elihu? There's 7 things that I think come through Elihu, not Elijah, he was a prophet. Elihu, we've been laughing about this. Elihu? Like, who are you? There's the dad joke for Elihu. Eli, who are you? You can use that. So I was thinking about a story like, okay, what is this like? What is this like when we want to hear 7 things that we know we need to hear, but we don't want to hear them? And I thought about when I was a kid. And when I was a kid, I hated cooked carrots. Like, I still don't really like cooked carrots, but I have like vivid PTSD memories of being a little kid and, you know, dinner's coming out and mom comes to the table with one of those square, like Corningware dishes. Maybe that's what they're called. They had the little blue flowers on the side of the glass top. And inside that little square dish were the little round sliced carrots. Ugh, I hated them. But my parents made me eat them. So you know what they did? To help me get them down, they said, hold your nose. And eat the carrots while you're holding your nose. And that way when you chew them up and you swallow them, you won't taste how bad they are. And then wash them down real fast with some milk. And then you get the taste out of your mouth, and then you can open your nose again, and okay, you got the carrots down. They're good for you, but I didn't want to eat the cooked carrots. For some of you right now, you might need to hold your nose. But there's some things that we need to know that you may not want to hear, especially in losing seasons. Now, we're not going to linger on these. We're going to move pretty quickly through them. But I want to name these 7 things and a little bit of how they came out in Elihu's speech. And I'd invite you to go back and read all of what Elihu has to say afterwards. But here it is. 7 things we need to know but don't want to hear in losing seasons. Number 1, suffering doesn't justify pride. Elihu said to Job, but you have said in my hearing, I heard the very words. And then he quotes Job. I am pure, I have done no wrong, I am clean and free from sin. Yet God has found fault with me. He considers me his enemy. He fastens my feet in shackles. He keeps close watch on all my paths. And then Elihu comes back and he says, but I tell you, Job, in this you are not right, for God is greater than any mortal. He sums it up. And he tells this to the group around. He says, Job says, I am innocent, but God denies me justice. So Elihu is saying to Job, hey, your suffering doesn't justify pride, that your sense of justice is higher than God's. And you know what? He was right. How do we know? God comes along in chapter 40 and says exactly the same thing. God says to Job, hey, who are you to discredit my justice? Do you know how everything works and how it was all created? And of course the answer was no. But the truth that Elihu brings out is this. Job wasn't suffering because of his sin, which is what the friends were all trying to get him to admit. Like, you must have sinned to bring on all this suffering. No, Elihu comes along and he's like, Job, I don't believe you're suffering because of sin. I believe you actually have done the right thing. But what I'm here to tell you is that because of your suffering, that's actually led you to sin. Like, now you're sinning in response to your suffering. It's not that your suffering came because of sin. See what I'm saying there? And what he's saying to Job is, hey, your suffering doesn't justify this prideful response to God. And that's something that we need to know, that when we're suffering, we don't want to hear, do we? So let's just hear it now, and maybe we can remember it in those times of suffering, that when we're suffering, it's not okay for hurting people to hurt people. Suffering doesn't justify pride. That's the first thing. Second, God gets our attention through conscience and suffering. Elihu says to Job, why do you complain to him that he responds to no one's words? For God does speak, now one way, now another, though no one perceives it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on people as they slumber in their beds, is one way God speaks. Or someone may be chastened on a bed of pain with constant distress in their bones. God does all these things to a person, twice or even 3 times, to turn them back from the pit, that the light of life may shine on them. Elihu says to Job, I know you're suffering, but God actually gets our attention through inward conscience and also through the pain that we're experiencing. That's something we need to know, but when we're suffering and when it's hurting, we don't need somebody coming along to tell us that, right? Like, if you're in pain, suffering, loss of whatever it may be, you don't need your friend or your spouse or your kid or your neighbor coming along and saying, well, I hope you're paying attention to what God's trying to tell you here, right? Like, don't be that guy. Don't be that lady. But the truth is, God does get our attention, both through conscience and through suffering. You know, a great example of that is the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. He was writing in 2 Corinthians 12 to a church much like ours, and he was talking about his role as an apostle. And he said, hey, in my role, God has shown me some pretty special things. I've seen some visions that are pretty important. But to keep me humble, God didn't just give me visions, he's also given me suffering. It's this thorn in the flesh the text talks about, that Paul sort of had to endure this long, we think probably for his remainder of his life, this suffering, this ailment, to keep him humble. God got his attention, both through conscience and through suffering. It's true. It's how God sometimes works. We need to know it. Don't always want to hear it, but Elihu brings it out. Number 3, we don't win by arguing with God. We win by submitting to him. Elihu says to Job, suppose someone says to God, I'm guilty, but I will offend no more. Teach me what I cannot see. If I've done wrong, I will not do it again. Should God then reward you on your terms when you refuse to repent? So Elihu's saying to Job, hey, God gets our attention through conscience, through suffering, and let's suppose somebody else is paying attention and they actually repent. And all you do is argue with God. Should God reward you for that? No, we don't win by arguing with God. We win by submitting to him. It can be hard to hear, but we need to know it. Number 4, demanding relief and justifying our, oh, wait a second, that's number 5. Number 4, we don't know justice better than God. We don't know justice better than God. Elihu says to Job, it is unthinkable that God would do wrong, that the Almighty would pervert justice. Who appointed him over the earth? Who put him in charge of the whole world? If it were his intention and he withdrew his spirit and breath, all humanity would perish together and mankind would return to the dust. He's saying basically the same thing. God comes along and says, do you know how everything works? Only God does. And in fact, if God stopped holding it all together right this minute, it would all just fade away. In other words, if God doesn't know justice, then there is no justice. Like, God's the one who invented justice. If he didn't invent it, you wouldn't even know what in the world you're talking about. So it's God. God's the one who knows justice. We don't know justice better than God. That's number 4. Number 5. Demanding relief and justifying our behavior stop us from hearing God. Elihu says to Job, people cry out under a load of oppression. They plead for relief from the arm of the powerful. But no one says, where is God, my maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us more than he teaches the beast of the earth and makes us wiser than the birds in the sky? He speaks to this natural instinct that says, yeah, when we're suffering, we cry out to God. We want relief. We demand relief sometimes, don't we? We justify our behavior because of the suffering that we are experiencing, because of the losses, the season that we're in. But what Elihu is saying is, what we should be asking is, where is God in this? He's my maker. He's the one who can speak to me through this. But if we get stuck in demanding relief, we get stuck in justifying our behavior, then it's going to stop us from hearing what God is trying to get our attention to say to us. Number 6, suffering reveals what's under the surface. Elihu says to Job, the godless in heart harbor resentment. Even when he fetters them, they do not cry for help. And he speaks to an instinct of the heart to just get bitter, to just get resentful. And what he's pointing out is the truth that suffering reveals what's under the surface. That can be a hard one to hear. pride under there? Or is it humility? Are we willing to learn the kind of humility that Job learned, modeled for us, even when it was hard to hear? Seventh and finally, God's ways are higher than our ways. And this is where Elihu ends his great speech to Job. Elihu says this, listen to the roar of his voice, to the rumbling that comes from his mouth. God's voice thunders in marvelous ways. He does great things beyond our understanding. Listen to this, Job. Stop and consider God's wonders. Do you know how God controls the clouds and makes his lightning flash? Out of the north he comes in gold and splendor. God comes in awesome majesty. The Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in power. In his justice and great righteousness, he does not oppress. Therefore people revere him. For does he not have regard for all the wise in heart? The climax of the message is that God's ways are higher than our ways. But even with all of his might and power and the force of the thunder that comes from his voice, he does not use that power to oppress us. But in fact, the final line that we get from Elihu, whether he's a prophet or a punk, the truth is, God has regard for the wise in heart. God has favor. God has love. God has forgiveness. God has grace. God has mercy. God has welcome for the wise in heart. And part of that wisdom that we need to pause to receive is the wisdom of humility. That we would humble ourselves before God. Which, by the way, is one of the great themes that's woven through the Old Testament and the New Testament. We're called to humble ourselves before God rather than wait for him to humble us. We're called to bow the knee, to surrender to Jesus as our King. One day, everybody is going to bow the knee. So humble ourselves before the Lord. James in the New Testament picks up on this. He says, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. He has regard for the wise in heart. But then the greatest act of humility, once again, comes back to Jesus. Philippians 2 speaks of his humility. He had all of the treasures of heaven that were rightfully his as the Son of God. He gave them up to become obedient, to humble himself, Philippians 2:8 tells us, even to the point of death. And his humility and his death is the only way that we can deal with the pride that lives at the deepest core within us. So we need to follow Job's example. We need to learn the kind of humility to deal with the pride that's naturally in us. But there's a pride that runs deeper than anything we can fix. Like we can't discipline our way into dealing with the pride at our core. Only Jesus can do that. And that's the gift he gives us. By humbling himself even to the point of death. When we receive the gift of salvation, when we receive the gift of the Spirit of Jesus, that is what breaks the power of death in our lives. That's what ultimately deals with the pride that lives at our core and that allows us, it opens us to hear what God has to say, even when it's hard to hear. Would you bow your heads with me for just a few moments as we invite God to just let these things settle in our hearts and in our minds, and to give us the humility to hear what he has to say to us, even though we know sometimes we don't want to hear it. And I want to speak to you if you're here and you've never come to that point where you've recognized what Jesus has done for you. When he gave his life, he humbled himself to a degree that you and I never can. And that's so that you and I can have a spirit within us, the Holy Spirit, that can cultivate a humility that will allow us to trust God and live well in losing seasons, in winning seasons, in every season. If you've never put your trust in Jesus, then that's your first step today. And you can do that simply by acknowledging in your own words, have a conversation, take time to talk to God and say, I see it now, I get it. My pride has kept me running the other way, trying to figure it out on my own. But I want to trust in you. I need your Spirit. So please forgive me. Come into my life. Teach me. I want to follow you. And share that with somebody who can help you take steps of following Jesus. Join us as a church of learning what it means to follow after Jesus. That might be your step of humility this morning. For all of us, I want you to stop and to consider, what is it that God might be trying to say to you right now? That you know you need to hear, you know it's right, but you haven't been willing to hear it. Might be one of the 7 things that Elihu said. It might be something else. But I want to give you 30 seconds of quiet, open space, and I want to invite you to take time to pray. Ask the Lord to reveal that thing to you and help you to have the humility, to have the wisdom, to trust God in it, and to do what he's calling you to do. And then in just a moment, we're going to stand and we're going to sing in response. But before we do, let's all take time to pray. We're going to respond by singing together. So let me invite you, go ahead and stand to your feet and hear this prayer as we prepare to respond in song. Father in heaven, Lord, we thank you for speaking through conscience, through suffering, Lord, through creation, the thunder, the lightning. Lord, you're speaking to us. Lord, I pray that you would open our hearts, open our minds to hear what you have to say. Give us the humility and wisdom to receive it.